What I'd like to do now, before opening up to the audience for questions, is give each of our panelists an opportunity to have 2 to 3 minutes for follow-up comments based on anything that they heard their fellow panelists say that they wish to comment on. Start with Allison.
Thanks. Is this on? The patient side already lost Levine, so I'm not sure how important this point is that I'm going to make, but Ken Geller mentioned or stated that the decision is quite narrow because the only devices that get pre-market approval are a tiny fraction of the devices that are approved. The numbers that he gave you are sort of comparing apples to oranges because when you talk about the devices that don't get pre-market approval, you're throwing in Band-Aids and toothpaste and tongue depressors, all sorts of devices that people aren't really suing over because they're not causing injury. But if you look at the devices that cause injury, the devices that are implanted inside you, those devices are the PMA devices. And the reason that legal is important is because it's those devices that are causing the majority of the injury that plaintiff's opportunity to seek compensation with respect to those devices, that's what's been cut off. A couple of the panelists mentioned that juries shouldn't get to decide, shouldn't get to sort of muck around in the FDA and manufacturers' determinations about what the best risk to safety ratio is, whether a product or a label is good enough. So I just want to point out that that's been the system for 70 years, and if it were a problem for juries to do that, we should have seen some examples. But the FDA and the manufacturers throughout this period of 5 to 6 years of litigation about preemption, they've never given examples of instances where a jury verdict put the manufacturers in a catch-22 position or interfered with FDA's ability to regulate a specific product or company or industry. I think I'll stop there.
I don't have much to add on Regal. I do think there are many instances, or at least some celebrated instances, where tort law has driven useful drugs off the market, but it's probably beyond the scope of preemption. The only thing I'd say about Wyeth versus Levine is that I don't think it's as grim a picture for drug companies as perhaps these presentations may have conveyed, or as optimistic a picture for plaintiffs, because the Supreme Court did recognize that there can be preemption, and whether there is preemption obviously turns on a quasi-factual inquiry as to whether the FDA would have allowed a change to be made. And I defer to Bob, who's much more familiar with the record in that case, as to whether Justice Alito got it right on the record or not, but in a lot of cases, including I think these SSRI cases that are heading down to the district court within the Third Circuit, I think there's going to be a very strong record that the FDA did not want particular warnings to be given. So I think there's a lot more to be played out in the whole area of prescription drug preemption.
Right, I would agree exactly with what Ken said. Backing up to his first comment, there are some examples of drugs and whole categories of drugs that really have been driven off the market or have not made it to market because of the tort litigation. We discussed some of these in the amicus brief that we did for pharmaceutical trade associations that we didn't burden you with in your materials, but it's available online and lots of places. Some examples of that are vaccines, which have become such a problem that Congress had to pass a special law which still hasn't solved all the problems. It's just basically so risky to develop vaccines that very few companies will do it. Contraceptive drugs are another example. Bendectin, which is a drug for morning sickness, is another example. So I think it goes back to our keynote address. There are two sides to this coin, and no drug is perfectly safe, but if you go too far in trying to avoid bad incidents, you're going to prevent people from benefiting from drugs that they could benefit from. On facts, again, we're trying to focus on things that will be more generally useful to you, so suffice it to say, I think Justice Alito was 100% right on the facts, and I think Justice Stevens is a magnificent justice, and I know he's a very famous alumnus of this school, but in this, one case, we think he maybe was not quite as careful with the facts as he should have been in that decision. But one other slightly more substantive thing I'll say, on this notion of having juries look at what the FDA, what the federal agency did as a matter of fact, again, I think ultimately that's going to lead to problems and friction, and it'll probably have to be further considered as time goes on. The Supreme Court recently had a case, the Buckman case, which was about fraud on the FDA. And it actually said they found implied preemption in a class of cases where the jury would look at whether the FDA was defrauded. I think there's a similar kind of issue here when, if the question for the jury is, well, did the FDA really look at this? How carefully did they look at it? How thoroughly did they look at it? It's not really something that's easy for a jury to second guess the federal agency.
Facts do matter in preemption. Each of these decisions is fact-inflected, and they should matter. The way that preemption works, though, legally, has to be remembered. And as Justice Stevens articulated it in Wyeth versus Levine, this is the preemption question. Quote, "The question we must decide is whether the FDA approvals provide Wyeth with a complete defense to Levine's tort claims. The way preemption works is whether the FDA gets it right or not, whether the drug company lies to the FDA or not, whether new facts come out later that no one could have known about before or not. The drug company is immunized from any tort liability. Nobody recovers. That's why preemption was such a big issue in the Vioxx litigation. Vioxx was recalled. Vioxx was implicated epidemiologically in thousands of excess heart attacks or strokes. But notwithstanding all of that medical fact, had preemption prevailed, it would have been a complete defense to any recovery. And when you have an extreme outcome like that, I would argue that not only are the facts very important, and a trial record is very important before decisions are made like that, but that not only the FDA, not only Congress, not only the drug companies, but also citizens in the community who serve on juries are entitled and required to weigh in on such profound questions. If you don't find preemption in a particular case, you're simply ensuring that that check and balance system goes forward. If you do find preemption in a particular case, you're stopping the inquiry. The facts don't matter. Tort law doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that FDA approval was obtained, rightly or wrongly, and it is a shield and it is a sword. And I don't think that most agency experts, most Congress people, and apparently at least a majority of the Supreme Court is comfortable with that type of an outcome across the board, uninflected by the facts.
Great. Well, I think we have just a few minutes for a couple questions.
To the two gentlemen on the jury question, we give juries, I spent all my life within jury trials exclusively. Now, we give them the power to decide whether a man or woman goes to the electric chair. Why should they not have the power?
Well, I mean, what I would say, it's not that the juries can't decide important questions. Of course they can and do. They decide some of the most important questions. My view would be that this particular kind of question, I mean, it is an important question, but that's not really the basis for my argument. It's just not the kind of question that a jury is, well, because it's really not the jury's fault. They're only told to look at one individual, and if you see the question, now you may not see the question the way I do, but if the question is whether the drug as a whole for all patients is beneficial or whether a particular set of warnings or place of drawing the line between underwarning and overwarning is the optimum place in terms of the best balance of benefits and risks. That's just not something the jury's going to see in an ordinary jury trial.
Why not? If you've got a good lawyer on both sides, I can't think of 12 average men and women. Now, I agree they may take
Well, I mean, juries can do it, and they do it. It's a question of who is the best decision maker for the situation, and, you know.
Okay, well, let's carry this on after the session and get a couple more questions in. I'm sure that one's resolvable.
You've talked about overwarning. Now, these warnings are basically given to the prescribing physician. How can a learned physician make an informed decision if he's not given all of the information? How can you over-inform a physician on all of the aspects of a drug when it's his job to decide whether the risks or benefits justify prescribing one drug over another for the condition that he diagnoses in his patient?
I think, I mean, physicians have limited time, and as wonderful as they are, you can't put everything in a set of warnings, or if you did, you'd get to the point where the physician is then having to make some choices about what parts I'm going to read, or what parts do I really pay careful attention to. And again, you know, maybe this is just sort of a basic difference of opinion about whether there are issues that shouldn't go to juries. You know, the FDA.
But I'm not talking about an HMO physician that doesn't take time to read.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
He needs a good doctor.
Could I just say something real quick? I think the overwarning issue is really just a non-issue. We've had suits against drug companies for decades, and if the result, the consequence of that was that that drug companies were going to start sticking everything they could think of on the label, that would have already happened. And it hasn't happened because drug companies don't want to stick everything they can on the label, because they're doing a cost-benefit analysis too, and they want to sell the product. And I think the evidence in the Vioxx case, for instance, shows that Merck knew that there was going to be cardiovascular problems with this drug, and they made the financial decision that it was worth it. So they're going to keep making those decisions that they've been making, and the overwarning just seems like a non-issue to me.
One more.
Do you think that with the new marketing of off-label usages of drugs and also for devices, that preemption has the same applicability?
You know, there have been a number of decisions that have expressly held that preemption does not even apply to the off-label marketing of a drug or either a medical device, because those are, that marketing occurs absolutely outside FDA approval. So that's kind of gray market or black market marketing. And even before Wyeth and Regal, a number of courts had found that you just don't have a preemption defense if you're going to do off-label marketing. That's something that drug companies do at their own risk and you know, hope for the best.
Okay, thank you very much.